Hey guys, Lee here with Tooth of the Arrow Broadheads. Today we have a cool video for you. We're going to talk about 5 key factors that impact your arrow's penetration and things that you can do to get better penetration on your next hunt. The reason we talk so much about penetration, particularly with fixed blade broadheads, is because better penetration means better blood trails. And that might sound a little weird, but think about it. If you have penetration to the point where you get a full pass through, there's 2 holes in your animal, you will get better blood trails than just 1 hole and that arrow sticking in there. Now, that's not to say you can't get good blood trails from shots where your arrow sticks in and never comes out. It's happened, but I've shot a lot of animals that have died really quickly, but never left a drop of blood because the arrow didn't exit. Most of the time when I shoot and I get a full pass through, there's a red carpet leading right to them, and ultimately, of course, that's what we want as bow hunters. Well, it's more recovered animals is the main goal. No matter what you're hunting, who you are, that's what we're all looking for. So let's get into it. Here's 5 factors to impact your arrow's penetration. So I want to talk to you guys about arrow diameter. It is a really crucial factor when it comes to how well your arrow is going to penetrate. So in general, there's like 5 different arrow diameters that people use. This is the micro, which is like a 4 millimeter. This is a small, which is like a 5 millimeter, and then a standard would be your 6 millimeter. There are bigger sizes, but those are generally just used for target archery. So for hunting purposes, we'll think of standard, small, and micro. So the only difference between these is really they're all a very similar weight arrow. This is from my personal collection of arrows. Is the thickness of the carbon. So what I've found over the years is that there's a few benefits to having a thinner arrow. One is that if you can get a thin arrow that has the same density as a thicker arrow, density for arrows is measured in grains per inch, GPI. So that's a matter of how much weight is in 1 inch of this carbon shaft. A thinner arrow with the same GPI as a thicker arrow is going to be denser, it's going to be stronger. So that is one factor to think about and one reason you might want to shoot a micro diameter arrow. The other reason is the sheer surface area of the arrow that you're trying to pass through the animal. A thicker diameter arrow, of course, will have more surface area. More surface area increases friction, hence reducing penetration. And you can see this when you shoot into target blocks. This micro diameter arrow in the same weight of the same bow will penetrate deeper than this small diameter or this standard diameter arrow 100%. It's simply less surface area that has to penetrate, therefore less friction. Now the other thing to think about is in wind. The smaller diameter arrows tend to perform better in wind as well for the same reason. Less surface area, there's less arrow to be pushed around by the wind. So really, I don't have any issues with shooting micro diameter arrows. I can't think of any reason not to. I have shot all 3 diameters, and for the last number of years I've been on micro, and I haven't switched back, and I don't plan on it. So I'm going to do a quick, highly exaggerated demonstration of what I mean about arrow diameter impacting penetration. So what I have here is I took a piece of paper and our XL 1 3/16 inch broadhead, and I poked a hole through it. Now I have a Sharpie and I have a nail. Okay, so the Sharpie is going to be your standard or thicker diameter arrow shaft. This is going to be your micro, and of course it's a big over exaggeration, but that's the point. So we have this same broadhead on both of our arrows. Okay, so that means the initial hole that is poked through the animal, that's a constant. That doesn't change. So now the only variable factor is the size of the arrow that we're trying to push through that hole. So if we take this Sharpie and push it through that hole, there's friction on all sides and a lot of it, right? And the hole size does not change. The broadhead already poked the hole. So there's a lot of friction with that thick diameter arrow or the Sharpie. If we take this nail and push it through the same size hole, it slides through with barely touching any edges. So the cut diameter, the hole you've already cut through that animal, is unchanged, but when you push the thinner arrow through it, it's going to get through with less friction and maintain more of its energy, hence increasing your arrow penetration significantly. So next time you're at the range shooting with buddies, I challenge you to pay attention to it. When you all shoot into the same 3D target or foam block, look at whose arrows are penetrating the deepest. And of course, it's not a perfect comparison because one guy might be shooting 80 pounds while your buddy might be shooting 60. But in general, you're gonna see that the thinner arrows are penetrating deeper pretty much always, and you can try it yourself too. If you want, you have a buddy who shoots the same spine as you, shoot one of your thicker or his thicker arrows out of your bow and do a comparison from the same bow, and you'll see that the thinner arrows are much better at penetrating and actually much harder to pull out. So the next thing we have to talk about that will definitely impact your arrow penetration is paper tuning. I know paper tuning is a bit of a hot topic, so I'm just going to give you my thoughts on it and what's worked for me over the years. So the first question, to paper tune or not to paper tune? I've heard a lot of guys who say, why would I paper tune? My arrows hit where I want them. Why should I care how they get there? Well, the reason for that is because if you don't paper tune, your arrows may get where you want them to, but you're going to waste a lot of the arrow's energy getting there. And what I mean by that is if your arrow is flying, it's hard to demonstrate on camera, but if your arrow is flying straight in a perfectly straight line, when the broadhead makes contact with the animal, all the momentum of the arrow is going to push the arrow directly through the animal. Now, if it's wobbling through the air, that's what happens if you don't paper tune. The point of paper tuning is that the tail end of your arrow perfectly follows the front of your arrow. And if you don't paper tune, your arrow may be flying through the air like this or like this. And you can actually tell how it is flying just by paper tuning. So when you shoot an arrow into an animal that is not shooting out of a paper tuned bow, let's say it's flying. This is of course a big over exaggeration of what it actually looks like. But let's say it's flying through the air like this. The point makes contact. Now the momentum is not working perfectly in line with the arrow, and you can visualize how this would impact your penetration. It's going to take energy for your arrow to try to straighten out in that hole it's poking, and that's going to slow it down. One way you can think about it is if you're pushing a car by yourself. I know that's very hard, but just think about the physics of it. If you're pushing a car by yourself, would it be better to push it from directly on the license plate to make it go forward, or would you push it from one of the tail lights? If you pushed it from one of the tail lights, think about what's going to happen, right? The energy you're putting into pushing the car is not working in the direction that you need the energy to be going to accomplish the task. And it works no differently with arrows. So that is why we paper tune. Now, the topic of paper tuning versus bare shaft tuning. Basically, bare shaft tuning is paper tuning, but without vanes on your arrow. Handful of pros and cons, I guess you could say, to each, but I've never bare shaft tuned, and there's a reason for it. Again, just my personal thoughts on the topic, but my thoughts on it are I would never shoot an animal without vanes on my arrow, so I don't care how my arrow flies without vanes. I'm going to build all my arrows the way they're going to be when I'm hunting, and then paper tune and get my bow set up for that. So paper tuning is crucial, and it's definitely something you want to do whether you shoot fixed blades or mechanicals. It'll make a bigger difference too if you are shooting fixed blades. You know, the people who say my arrows hit where I want them to, why do I care how they get there? Those are generally people who just shoot field points for target archery, or if you shoot mechanicals, those are much more forgiving for problems with your arrow flight. And it just has to do with aerodynamics. But when you put a fixed blade broadhead on the front of your arrow, there's definitely a level of steering that the broadhead can do if your arrow and bow are not set up properly. So paper tuning is how you make sure any blade you put on the front of your arrow is not going to impact the flight, and that's how we get tooth of the arrow broadheads to fly so well. I shoot out to 80. I have shot to 100 yards with mine, and they do shoot I don't shoot great at 100 yards, but my arrows and field points group, my broadheads and field points group together, and it's because of paper tuning. And to sum that up, basically, the end of my arrow is flying perfectly in line with the front of my arrow, so it's getting there as quickly as possible without wobble in the air and not allowing the blades to have an impact on the flight. And then when it hits my target or animal, it's the way that it's flying allows its momentum to work as efficiently as possible to poke a hole deep through that animal and get a pass through. So the next factor we have to talk about is a tricky topic because there's no completely right or completely wrong answer. The topic is weight versus speed. There's definitely a trend going around the archery world right now about shooting crazy heavy arrows to maximize penetration. And then there's a lot of guys who just want to shoot the fastest arrow possible because that will get the arrow to the animal as quick as possible, reduce the chance of string jumping. Now, in my opinion, there's validity to both. There's no doubt that a super light arrow flying super fast is not great. Momentum works better than kinetic energy when it comes to penetration, and that's a whole nother deep topic we can certainly dive into. And if you want me to dive into it, let us know in the comments, and I can do a write-up about it. But we want to focus more on momentum versus kinetic energy. Momentum is what's going to be the factor that actually continues to push your arrow through the animal, versus kinetic energy being a measure of what your arrow is doing when it hits the animal, not what it does after, while it's working its way through. So speed versus weight. If we have a very heavy arrow, let's say you're shooting a 650, 700 grain arrow, that's really heavy. It's going to penetrate, I'm sure, very well when it hits that animal. The problem with that is it's very hard to get that arrow flying at a reasonable speed. If you're shooting an arrow 250, 260 feet per second, in terms of compound archery, that's pretty slow. And the risk you run with doing that is that animals, particularly whitetails, they string jump. And it can take a string jumping can make a shot you make that is perfect a disaster. I've seen it time and time again. A few years ago, I shot a whitetail out of a tree stand at 26 yards, and she was definitely alert. I should have waited for her to relax a little bit before I took my shot, but shooting a 280 feet per second arrow at 26 yards, she completely ducked my arrow. They have insane ability to do that. So yes, the faster you get your arrow to the animal, the less of a chance there is of that happening. So maybe we don't want to go crazy heavy. It'll slow our arrow down too much. Now, if we go super fast, yeah, you might get your super fast and light, we'll say. You might get your arrow to that animal very quickly to the point where string jumping won't matter. Your arrow's already hit it. That's great. But what happens with the slow arrows is the light arrows is they don't have a huge amount of weight helping to carry the energy through the animal, and they tend to stop. They tend to stop early, meaning they don't penetrate that deep. Okay, so we'll take all this information. What does it all mean? How can I apply this? Here is my arrow philosophy for you. That's worked great for me. And again, this is just what I do. It's not the only way, but this is what works really well for me and all the clients I've done work for over the years. So out of my bow, I want to shoot the heaviest arrow I can while maintaining a speed of around 270 to 280 feet per second. I'll say that one more time. I want to shoot the heaviest arrow I can at about 270 to 280 feet per second. That's the entire philosophy. And the reason for that is every projectile, whether it's a dart, whether it's a baseball, whether it's a bullet, has an optimal speed at which it will fly. You guys out there who reload your own rifle cartridges will know this. You'll tinker around with a round. At some point, you'll add too much powder, and adding more power is now making your groups worse. Well, why did that happen? Basically, you were trying to make that projectile fly faster than it was designed to fly. And that's how it works with every projectile. There's an optimal speed. And with arrows, every arrow will be a little different, of course, but we've found, and lots of other great hunters I've talked to have found that 270 to 280 feet per second range, arrows fly really well in. And there isn't a huge amount of string jumping that animals can do when they are flying at that speed. Now, they certainly can, but it just seems like that sweet spot. and the penetration sure is good with the weight that you can attain at that arrow speed. For example, I shoot a 70-pound bow, 30.5-inch draw length, so I'm able to shoot 273 this year feet per second, and I have a 556 grain arrow. That is a sweet combo for me. I use it for everything. I don't change my setup for everything or for anything. I use that for whether I'm hunting whitetail, bear, whether I'm traveling and hunting a caribou. I use the same setup for everything. So that if you're wondering, should I go heavy, should I go fast and light, try this. This is what I believe to be the best of both worlds, and you will get amazing arrow flight out of it. I promise you that. The next factor to talk about with arrow penetration will be your broadhead choice. It absolutely makes a difference what broadhead you choose to put through an animal. Of course, the bigger a broadhead, the more surface area you're trying to pass through that hole, so the more friction there will be, and it'll slow your arrow down. Less penetration. So in a perfect world, I mean, you could shoot a field point through an animal, and I promise you that'll be the best penetrating option you get. But we don't want to do that for obvious reasons. It's just not ethical. We need a blade on the end of our arrow. Okay, so what does that leave us with? Well, we have mechanicals. Mechanicals, they fly very well because of their compact design, but when they hit an object to open, first of all, it takes a lot of energy to open that broadhead up, so that slows your arrow and decreases your penetration right off the bat. And then when you get a big two inch blades on each side, that is a lot of surface area to pass through an animal, and they tend to not penetrate as deep as fixed blade broadheads. So when we talk about fixed blade broadheads, there's a number of options. We have our 1 inch. This is a prototype head, that's why it's silver. We have our 1 inch and our 1 3/16 inch head. Now, our 1 inch is a better penetrating head than the 1 3/16, absolutely. Simply because it's a more compact design, there is less surface area to pass through the hole. Now, your personal philosophy in bow hunting has to come into play here. Do you want that bit more penetration in a slightly smaller hole, or do you want that bigger hole and a little bit less penetration? I can't say there's a right answer, and I tend to switch back and forth between both heads because I'm constantly changing my mind and testing things. And so yeah, there's no right or wrong answer exactly on that, but play with both and see what you like. Either way, keep Broadhead Choice in mind when you're trying to build an arrow and trying to increase your penetration. It'll make a big difference. So the last thing to talk about with arrow penetration is going to be shot placement. Now, this is something you honestly don't have a lot of control over on a fine level, but it's something to keep in mind regardless. If you are someone who likes to shoot at shoulders, which some people do, some people down south with smaller whitetails and smaller animals shoot through shoulders all the time, and it works great. There's nothing wrong with that. That will impact your arrow's penetration though. So you might want to adjust your types of shots you're making on bigger game, like an elk or a moose. There's not a chance I'm putting an arrow through that shoulder. I want my arrow as far away from it. I don't care what broadhead arrow combination you're shooting. An Alaskan or a Yukon moose shoulder is going to stop an arrow. There's no doubt about that. So think about that kind of stuff. Even when you're shooting behind the shoulder through ribs, if you hit a rib, it's going to slow your arrow down. Of course it will. It's going to penetrate less than if your arrow slips clean through two ribs on both sides, which will hardly slow your arrow down. But of course you don't have that kind of control, and it's crazy to think that you could. You don't. But the point behind all this is that we want to build an arrow that when things go wrong, when accidents happen, the animal moves and you hit a shoulder, or your arrow does hit square on a rib, we want an arrow and broadhead combination that is going to do the best job possible for those unforeseen circumstances. So hope you guys learned something today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on arrow philosophy. Feel free to message us on Instagram, comment on this video, anything. We'd love to hear from other hunters on what your philosophy in arrow building and penetration is. Thanks for watching.